So today we're going to take a look at something called homeostasis. Homeostasis is something that we're going to talk a lot about, how our cells go through this process, and something called feedback loops, which help our cells maintain homeostasis. Today we're just going to learn the general concept of what homeostasis is and what feedback loops are. So let's take a look at homeostasis first. Homeostasis is just a complicated word that refers to the idea that organisms and cells maintain their internal physical and chemical conditions despite any changes in their environment. So what do I mean by that? The best example I can give you is body temperature, right? If you take your body temperature with a thermometer, you'll probably get somewhere around 98.6. That's your internal body temperature. Now, if you go outside on a cold day and take your temperature, you'll still get 98.6. And then if you go into a really hot room, maybe in summertime, and you take your temperature, you'll still get 98.6. The internal condition of your body is going to stay the same despite there being all these changes around you. Your body temperature stays the same despite all these changes around you. And this not only happens with entire organisms like yourself, it happens with individual cells. Cells go through this process of homeostasis to maintain the amount of salt or the amount of sugar that they have or the amount of water that they have in each and every cell in your body. They're going through this process of homeostasis. We'll talk about how cells maintain homeostasis on another lecture, but today we're just going to focus on what homeostasis is. So if you think about individual organisms, they've all evolved to survive with an ideal set of conditions, kind of like body temperature. I liken this to a car, right? If you start your car up on a really cold day and try to drive it, it'll go bump, 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 bump. The engine runs really poorly. That's because your car engine is designed to run when it's warm. So if you heat up your car first on a cold day and let the engine warm up, you'll find that your car drives a lot better. Your engine's designed to run with that ideal set of conditions. It's the best condition for it to burn the fuel and get the energy out. So the same is true for living organisms. They've evolved to survive with a set of ideal conditions. And so organisms spend a lot of energy and effort maintaining those conditions, whether it's keeping your body temperature the same or keeping the amount of water in your body the same. They're always trying to keep this set of conditions we call homeostasis. You can think about it when we learned about tolerance curves in our first unit. We talked about over a range of variables, the population of organisms changing and them having an optimal range. So whether this is temperature or amount of rainfall or the amount of light, organisms have this set of conditions where they survive the best. And if you go too high or too low, that population starts to dip off. This optimum range is where organisms try to maintain homeostasis. Organisms try to stay in that optimum range, and they'll make adjustments to keep themselves in that optimum range. If it gets too hot, they'll cool back down. If it gets too cold, they'll heat back up because they're trying to stay in that ideal optimum range. And the other thing to note is that if an organism goes too far to the left or right of this, eventually, just like the population, the individual organism will die. So if you get too hot, if you have a fever that goes too high, you start to get sick, and eventually that can kill you. Same thing if you get too cold, you go into hypothermia, and eventually your body shuts down. So too high or too low, so that's your body's always trying to stay right there in the middle where it runs the best. You can also think of it this way: homeostasis is where your body maintains a set of equilibrium. So equilibrium is just when an organism makes sure that the inputs and outputs are equal. So there's no net change to the system. You can think of this, I like the analogy of a nightclub, right? If you think about a nightclub and the line outside the nightclub, maybe that nightclub only holds 100 people. So there's a bouncer here at the door, and he's counting, okay, 2 people just came out of the nightclub, so I'll let 2 more people in. The amount of people inside the nightclub never change because the amount of people going in and the amount of people coming out always stays the same. 2 people out, 2 people in. Your body does this with all sorts of things. If you think about water, if you drink a lot of water, you'll go to the bathroom a lot because your body is keeping the amount of water inside your body the same. More water comes in, more water goes out. If you drink less, you'll go to the bathroom less. Your body does this with all sorts of things, whether it's water, whether it's salt. What goes in is what comes out, and everything inside your body stays relatively the same. So your body uses something called feedback, or organisms use something called feedback to help maintain homeostasis. We're going to learn about 2 types of feedback, positive and negative feedback. Only one of them is used to actually maintain homeostasis. But it's important to learn about both. So feedback is just a fancy word for the way that an organism responds to change. So anytime there's a change in the environment or a change in the conditions inside that organism, feedback is the way that an organism can respond. So this diagram helps explain the two types a little bit better. You can think about it this way. You have an organism's normal condition. Maybe we're talking about body temperature again, and that's 98.6. Something in the environment might cause that normal condition to change. So let's say, again, it's body temperature. Maybe it's going outside on a cold day causes your body temperature to drop. That's the change. From there, your body is going to respond to the change, and it's going to respond to the change in one of two ways. The first way is it can make a response that causes it to go back to the normal condition. So let's say, for example, you go outside on a cold day, your body will shiver, it will try to heat itself back up to bring itself back to its normal condition of 98.6. We call this negative feedback. The other way a body can respond, or an organism can respond, is that it can go further away from the normal condition. So it can actually go further towards the change. So this might be if your body starts to heat up and then you get a fever and you go even hotter. That's positive feedback because you're not going back to the normal 98.6. You're getting hotter and hotter and hotter, positive feedback. Put a little star next to positive feedback because most of the time your body does not go through positive feedback. Positive feedback can eventually lead to you going to one of those limits of tolerances and causing your body to shut down or that organism to shut down. But let's look at negative and positive feedback just a little bit closer. So I'm going to start with negative feedback because, again, negative feedback is when it brings the organism or that response causes the organism to go back to its normal condition. So this is what leads to homeostasis. This is the examples where you go back to your normal condition. Anytime an organism reverts the change back to where it started, that's negative feedback. Let me give you two examples of that. The first one might, again, is just body temperature. So let's say you go outside on that cold day and your body goes below 98.6. It's cold out, your body temperature drops. Well, what does your body do? You start to shiver. Shivering is what creates friction. That friction heats you up, and that heat brings you back up to 98.6. So this is an example of a change. You got cold, but you shivered to heat yourself back up. That's an example of negative feedback. It's important when you think about the word negative. In negative feedback, you don't think of it as a bad thing or means it's getting lower. It simply means that you're doing the opposite of what the change was. So if the change was that your body got cold, the response was to heat back up. You did the opposite. Let's look at this example too. Same thing. Let's say you go outside on a hot day and your body temperature goes above 98.6. Well, what does your body do? Your body starts to sweat, and that sweat evaporates, the heat goes with it, and that cools your body back down. So in this case, you heated up, and your response was to cool back down. You're doing the opposite of what the change was. The change was, I got hot, so I cooled back down. That's negative feedback. It's bringing you back to normal, and it's helping you maintain your condition at that ideal body temperature of 98.6. So that's an example of negative feedback. Positive feedback behaves a little differently, and like I said, it doesn't happen too often. Positive feedback occurs when an organism or a cell responds to the change, causing it to go further away from its normal condition. And I'll give you an example of this in a second, but I want you to understand that this creates what we call a feedback loop, and that's why it doesn't happen so often. So a feedback loop is where things get building on each other. I like to use the analogy of a microphone that's plugged into an amplifier and a speaker, right? So if you have a microphone that's plugged into a speaker, that microphone, you shout into it, the amplifier is making your voice come out louder than the speaker. You hold that microphone up to the speaker, what happens? You've probably heard this happen before. Sound goes through the microphone, it gets amplified and comes out louder through the speaker. That sound goes back into the microphone, gets even louder, and comes even louder out the speaker. It goes around and around and around, and eventually the speaker blows. You know this happens if someone holds a microphone really close to the speaker. It starts off, it gets louder and louder and louder until eventually the speaker will break because the sound is getting so loud, or until it shuts off. But that's an example of a positive feedback loop because the stimulus keeps going and going and going and louder and louder and louder. So we're getting further away from the normal condition. Let's look at an example of this. This is not an example of it happening in a living organism, but it's a clever example. If you think about the cafeteria, everyone's eating lunch. What happens if, say, one student just decides to throw their food across the room? Well, if one student throws their food across the room, and let's say that hits another student, and a couple students see that, what do? Well, they start to throw their food, and maybe their food hits a couple more tables, and then everyone starts to throw their food, and eventually you have a food fight. That's an example of a positive feedback loop. You have a change, one kid throwing their food, but that causes two more kids to throw their food and five more kids to throw their food. And it keeps building and building and building until everyone's throwing their food around. That's an example of a positive feedback loop. Now let's look at an example of this happening in the human body. This is a pretty cool example. Contractions during childbirth. So the contractions are what help push the child out of the mother during childbirth. It's the contraction of the muscles. When a mother has their first contraction, what happens is it releases a hormone called oxytocin. And what oxytocin does is trigger more contractions. So the first contraction triggers more contractions. And every contraction after that produces even more oxytocin. That produces even more contractions. And that's why during childbirth, contractions get more frequent. They start maybe an hour apart, and then maybe half an hour apart, and then maybe a few minutes apart. Because every contraction is triggering more and more contractions. That's a positive feedback loop because it keeps building on itself. It keeps going further and further away from the normal condition, and keeps kind of repeating itself. Contractions producing more contractions. Now, what's important to note is that in the human body, if there's ever a positive feedback loop, it needs a way to shut itself off. Because if this process kept going, women would be in childbirth forever. They never stop being in labor. So once that child is born, it shuts off. If it didn't, eventually it would kill the person because you'd have more and more contractions. It would never stop. These hormones would keep building up. The same is true for fever, and it does happen when people have fevers. If your body gets too hot and it keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter, eventually your body shuts down. People can die from having a fever if that fever keeps building. So it's important to note that positive feedback doesn't happen too often because of these feedback loops. And if there's no way to shut off that feedback loop, it will eventually lead to the person dying. So just a quick review because it's important to distinguish between the two. Negative feedback brings you back to your normal condition. If you get too hot, you cool back down. If you get too cold, you heat back up. You're going back to normal. Positive feedback brings you further and further away from your normal condition. That creates a feedback loop, and it generally doesn't happen in living organisms because of that reason.